You probably touch a counter more often than you realize. At the grocery store, your items slide across it. At the bank, you stand in front of one. At home, you lean on it while chopping vegetables or waiting for coffee to brew. The word counter feels so ordinary that it almost disappears into the background. But once you stop and ask why it's called a counter, things get surprisingly interesting. After all, nothing about a modern counter looks like it's actively counting anything. So today, let's answer the question, why do we call it a counter? Where did the name come from? And why did it stick for centuries? Let's get into it, right here on History of Simple Things. The word counter has nothing to do with furniture, at least not originally. It comes from the Old French comptoir, which traces back to the Latin computare, meaning to calculate or count. This same root gave us words like account, compute, and computer. So from the very beginning, a counter wasn't an object, it was an action. A counter was a place where numbers were handled, money was reckoned, and transactions were carefully tracked. In medieval marketplaces, trade was messy and risky. Coins varied wildly in size, weight, and purity. You couldn't just trust that a coin was worth what it claimed. Merchants had to inspect, weigh, and count every piece of money they received. To do this reliably, they needed a designated surface, a flat, controlled space where coins could be spread out, sorted, and tallied. That surface became known as the counter, literally the place where counting happened. This wasn't optional. Mistakes meant losing money, cheating was common, counting was survival. As shops became more permanent, counters evolved into fixed structures. But their role wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The counter marked a clear boundary between customer and merchant. On one side were the goods, the records, and the money. On the other side was the buyer. The counter was the neutral ground where trust was negotiated. This separation helped protect valuables and reinforced authority. Even today, this boundary still exists. You instinctively know you shouldn't walk behind a counter unless invited. That unspoken rule has medieval roots. Early counters weren't always the long horizontal surfaces we know today. Some were tall benches, others were chest-like structures. The shape didn't matter. The function did. If money, goods, or measurements were being counted there, it was a counter. Over time, as tools like ledgers, scales, and cash drawers became common, counters adapted to support them. Their design followed their purpose. Once the idea of a counter existed, it spread quickly. Banks used counters to manage deposits and withdrawals. Ticket offices counted admissions. Pharmacies counted pills. Post offices counted letters and packages. Everywhere accuracy mattered, counters appeared. The word stayed consistent because the function stayed consistent. Controlled counting and exchange. Kitchen counters are a relatively modern invention. Early kitchens relied on tables, hearths, and workbenches. But as homes modernized, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, kitchens needed fixed work surfaces. These weren't just places to set things down. Ingredients were measured, portions were divided, and recipes were followed step by step. Counting returned, this time in cups, teaspoons, and servings. Calling them counters made sense. They weren't for sitting, they were for working, measuring, and organizing. You behave differently at a counter than at a table. Tables invite sitting and lingering. Counters invite action. You chop, assemble, check, and verify at a counter. That subtle psychological difference reflects the word's origin. A counter is where things are processed, not relaxed over. The word didn't stay physical. We use counter as a verb, to counter an argument, to counter a move, to counterbalance. These meanings come from the same idea, responding with calculation and equal measure. Even encounter shares this root, originally meaning to meet someone face to face. Once again, it's about meeting, measuring, and responding. Counters aren't passive objects. They're stages for human behavior. Complaints happen there, deals are negotiated there. Tension, trust, and resolution all play out across a counter. That's why removing counters from stores can feel uncomfortable. Even with self-checkout, people often want a physical place where the exchange feels complete. Today, machines do most of the counting. Barcodes, scanners, and software handle what humans once did manually. Yet the counter remains. Language preserves function long after tools change. We still dial phones and rewind videos. And we still use counters, even when the counting is invisible. The counter remains the symbolic endpoint of a transaction. Counters quietly enforce trust without us noticing. When you place items on a counter, you're signaling readiness to complete an exchange. When a cashier pulls the item toward their side, the transaction has begun. This choreography feels natural because it has been repeated for centuries. The counter organizes who does what and when. Many tech-forward stores try to eliminate counters entirely, but most eventually bring them back in some form. People want a physical endpoint, a place where the transaction ends. Without a counter, exchanges can feel unfinished, even if the payment went through digitally. A counter isn't just furniture. It's a linguistic fossil, a reminder of a time when every transaction required careful attention, trust, and human judgment. So next time you rest your hands on a counter, remember, you're standing where counting once meant everything. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.